Hey there, everybody.
Hello.
Um, so I have it on good authority that my original recording quality is terrible. So we are re-recording Chapter 6 of The Ship Who Sang by Anne McCaffrey. And we're going to try and get the same cutoff point as the next video, but we'll see what happens. Also, Uh, I was asked, do I watch my own videos? And the answer is no. And apparently, my voice is a lot higher pitched than I thought it was. It's kind of embarrassing. Oh well, no time for that. So, the partnered ship. Hurtling through space at speeds no unprotected human could tolerate, Helva contemplated the delightful knowledge that she had paid off her indebtedness to the Central World's brain brawn ship service. She was her own mistress, free, and free to choose, at long last, a partner, a brawn, a mobile human to companion her wherever she chose to wander. She was no longer limited to those sterling souls fresh and eager from academy training, fully indoctrinated in Central World's ethos, conditioned to a set way of thinking and acting, molded according to predetermined physical, intellectual, spiritual, psychological requisites, and not what she had in mind. She could pick anyone now. She could. Well, now, come to think of it, she couldn't. Bronze, for all their shortcomings, were not ordinary technicians cranked out by the thousands from specialist programs on every planet. They were especially trained and educated to function in an unusual partnership. She could not pick out an agreeable personality and find him deadheading on that charm. Even on short contracts with an individual in an bleh, with an industrial or a planetary agency, she'd have to rely to a certain degree on a brawn with sense, integrity, and a certain breadth of education, or she'd get royally rooked industrially and systematically, and besides, she wanted a permanent partner, not another transient. She wanted companionship, an intelligent, sympathetic friend, not a passive employee. Another factor limited her field further. Many otherwise well adjusted citizens of a complex civilized galaxy were revolted or superstitiously terrified at the thought of a human being entombed in a bulkhead, connected to the operational circuitry of a powerful spaceship. The neurosis could even extend to personalities like Terran, who deluded themselves that a shell person was really not human and was actually a highly sophisticated computer. Very few people she'd met, Helva admitted sadly, thought of her as Helva, a person, a thinking, feeling, rational, intelligent, eminently human being. Jenin had. Theoda, except for that one brief instance of rapport, had been too immersed in her lifelong expiation to entertain a personal reaction to Helva, the human. And although Kira Falernova had been with her over 3 years, neither of them had let the friendship develop into a deep attachment. In fact, the only mobile human who appeared to regard Helva as Helva was Niall Paralon, and for all Helva knew, he had merely developed an effective way of handling his BB ship subordinates by alternately praising and insulting them in that highly personal and stimulating way. And yet, he had stayed on the tight beam for 3 days, nursing that tenuous trace of her whereabouts. He could just as easily have delegated the duty to a regular comm man. That he hadn't done so absolved him of her previous grievances. She hoped someone had discovered him asleep at the control panel. He must have been in a deuced and comfortable position to snore that way. Helva chuckled to herself. Too bad he wasn't bigger, he'd have made a good brawn. And yet he was passed over while someone like that nardy idiot Terran, tall, brawny enough to look at, not only got into training, but completed the rigorous course. He must have done it, as Niall had acidly suggested, on theory credits. Perhaps Central Worlds had better reevaluate their image requirements as a result of this Borealis fiasco. What heavy worlders like Paralon lacked in stature, they made up in mass and pure cussedness. Fartles, Helda said in an unaccustomed profanity. The word echoed satisfactorily through the empty cabins. I wonder if he stayed awake long enough to record my divorce. She didn't like to contemplate Niall's remarks anent ditching Terran. She could practically hear his rasping voice reminding her that he'd tried to talk her out of Terran. For a smart ship, you can be a dumb broad. Well, it hadn't been a complete disaster. She'd have that to counter Paralon's scorn. In fact, if Terran hadn't been such an irritating dolt, the Zyklon creature would never have gotten into the main cabin. She and Terran wouldn't have been overwhelmed, and she wouldn't have made enough in bonuses and rewards to pay off so soon. That was such a comforting thought, to accomplish payoff so early on in her career, to reach the goal all BB ships dreamed of. So now what? She needed a brawn, one of her exceeding careful choice, and she needed another goal, a point, a destination. Maybe one would supply the other, or vice versa. I could go to the Horsehead Nebula, she said aloud for the sound of it. And the sound triggered a carefully suppressed memory. Jenin leaning against the console, grinning at her, his eyes alight with affection and humor. If they ever take us off milk runs, we'll make a stab at the nebula, huh? Well, she was off the milk runs, but Jenin lay dead in Regulus Base Cemetery, all their wild, happy schemes entombed with him. The challenge of such a flight, unaccompanied, was as empty as her ship self. Horsehead Nebula, indeed. To divert her trend of thought, she ran a rapid calculation. Oh, she could make it, for all her present material dependence on man. Her pile was fresh, though she wished someone would rattle a few brains and develop an energy source that could utilize the full potential of the FTL principle. It was like having two high gears in a powerful ground car that couldn't be used because they'd burn up all available fuel in a few milliseconds. But as it was, she could reach the Horsehead in 100 standard years at her present top speed. And then what? You needed someone to celebrate victory with, to extol a notable achievement, or any triumph was empty. If there was no goad to progress, advance was sterile. You needed a goal, or there was no point to anything. Now, Helva could understand why older class ships suddenly opted out for no discernible reason, and she wondered why payoff had seemed so enviable a state. Here she was, and where was she? Shell people like Amon and Triel, so determined to get here, would never believe that it was the act of paying off that really mattered. The ship-to-ship band bleeped through her gloomy reflections. Helva, this is the 422. Sylvia! Oh, from you I'll accept that name. Rumor is that you have reached payoff. According to my computations, I have. Well, what's the matter with you, then? That's not the end of the world, it's just the beginning. Of what? Say, that Borealis sense deprivation hit you hard. No, really, I'm all right. I just don't like solitude. You don't appreciate being well off, Sylvia went on in her usual cynical way. I'd have thought you'd be glad to be rid of that asinine Terran. He reminded me so much of that half-lobed... Well, never mind him. Helva, you're going to have to watch your step. You've paid off in less than 10 standard years. That's too soon. Much too soon for Central Worlds to be willing to let you off their hook. I'm not so sure I'm off, Helva replied. What do you mean? Listen. And Sylvia's voice sounded fierce. If there's any funny taping on you, you call in the mutant monitors or the Society for Preservation of the Rights of Intelligent Minorities. That'd be Emma King and Rocco on Regulus. Rocco! Emma King's Sprim got the fancy uniform, but it's Rocco who has the brains. You get them in on any discussions. Demand a recalculation of all costs from the day they shelled you out of your cradle. Sylvia, there's not going to be any trouble about the payoff figures. I'm clear. I'm sure of it. Well, then what's the problem? What do I do now? Sylvia spluttered for a moment. Don't you realize? She demanded angrily. That industrial complexes, and not to mention planetary unions, will pay you any figure you name, for any time you'll spare them. Of course you do have to watch yourself with private industry. They play dirty. And before you touch down at Regulus, you call Broly. A city shell person always knows who's ready to bid and who you can trust. Particularly Broly. He'll get you a good contract. And a good brawn? Are you on that wheeze again, Helva? Sylvia was disgusted. Change around. Grab the kind of technician you need for an assignment, then drop him. I'd have thought you'd have quite enough of bronze for a while. Quite enough of bronze, yes. I just want one who will stay a while. If only Jenin... If converts no energy and has no credit. You don't seem to realize, Helva, that you're a top BB ship. You'll have Brons begging to board you. Take your pick. Sure, you and Jenin made a fine team. His death was a piece of rotten luck, but he is dead. Let him rest in peace. Find yourself another guy, someone up to your caliber, not another blunt-brained bastard like the one you shouted off your deck. Helva was startled that Sylvia had already heard about that. And if you've got to have a partner, grab one young, train him up right. The Academy ruins more than it improves. You ought to know by now what you don't want in a partner. Teach him what he ought to know. Don't wait for the impossible. Engineer it. And look out for Riley's conniving. He's going to try and keep you on the roster, or I haven't been around this service for 400 years. I am out of beverage. Why have you been around for 400 years, Sylvia? There was such a long silence, Helva wondered if they'd gone beyond contact range. I don't ask myself that anymore, Helva. I used to when I was your age and payoff seemed close. Then we ran afoul of a meteor swarm off Sadsalund, and, well, there's usually something interesting to do for Central Worlds. I've had good partners and bad ones, too. Her voice wavered from now from attenuation. Be careful, Helva. Don't sell yourself cheap. The contact broke then, but the comfort of Sylvia's astringent concern overshadowed the substance of her warning for a time. To reassure herself, Helva ran through the computations again, starting with the fearful debts of her early infancy and childhood, the pituitary adjustments so that her body would not outgrow the final capsule, and the delicate brain surgery that had made Helva the ship that had been, as always, expensive. However, since there would be no slaves nor indentured servants within the Central World's autonomy, committees and organizations of dedicated citizens decreed that a salary scale, a bonus and award system, should provide incentive and remuneration for shell people in every occupation. Now, Helva could see that the subtle, massive conditioning that she'd received in her formative years was double-edged. It made her happy as a shell person. It had dedicated her to her life and service, and it made payoff a mockery. What else could a BB ship do but continue as she had started, in the service? The same must apply to shell people trained to manage ships, mining planets, or industrial complexes. And yet, there was compensation. The memory of Jenin rose to plague her again, to console. Those had been marvelous years, short but full of a glowing wonder of self-discovery and joint exploration. They'd been eager for the challenge of each new mission to be faced together. They'd taken a perverse pride in her sobriquet, and Jenin had to defend them both against the ridicule of other Brons until the Juliet Hotel 834 had been admired and respected as the ship who sang. Jenin had been unique, but surely there would be another man with other qualities to recommend him. I love you, you little weirdo. Yes, I'm looking at you, and I'm calling you a weirdo, you cardboard-eating goof. She wondered if she had unconsciously chosen Taron because he had been the antithesis of her first Brawn. Well, Sylvia was right. She ought to find a reasonable compromise, train him up as a proper Brawn, train him up to consider her a person, not a ship, nor an emotionally responsive computer. She was paid off. She could take time to look around, to let Broly find a reliable, independent contract. Idly she wondered how long it had taken the Foxtrot Golf 602 to contract with the Alfecan Confederacy. He'd paid off just before her birth. She'd met him once with Jenin, but both he and his partner affected an amused, detached superciliousness that had been offensive. She could, she supposed, broadcast an advertisement right now. She began to feel better. Action, that's what she needed. But perhaps it would be smarter to report to Regulus Base, make sure that all was in order. It was only sensible to keep on good terms with Central Worlds. She'd need their technicians and maintenance sheds for any overhauls. She found that she had slowed somewhat, and added thrust, confidently speeding back to Regulus. She began to cast up a list of qualities that she wanted in a partner, and the traits to avoid. So pleasant were her mediations that it seemed no time at all before she had to request landing instructions from CENTCOM. Why, Helva, As I live and breathe, Niall Paralon answered her. Oh, did you catch up on your beauty sleep? Both. Both? I caught up with beauty and with sleep. She didn't mind you snoring? They were too exhausted to hear and much too grateful to comment, my gal. I am not your gal. The endearment is considered an accolade by many. Oh, how do you arrange such a delusion? Niall chuckled maliciously. Ha! I pick my partners carefully, not just for the symmetry of their features and the density of their skulls. All right, Paralon, you've counted coup. By the way, I trust you stayed awake long enough to register Terran's dismissal. Oh, yes, and I took even greater pleasure in posting the penalty to your account. Pfft, I can afford it. I know, and there was an unexpected grimness in his voice. Put your lazy tail down on pad 3, administrative landing. An official welcoming committee has been waiting for you. You mean an emancipation delegation? But CENTCOM was silent. Well, she'd got off lightly at Paralon's hands. She'd miss him. His caustic manner had been stimulating, and whatever his motives, he had been there at the end of the tight beam. Independence would have its own compensations, wouldn't it? As she jockeyed down with finicky precision onto the number 3 pad, she experienced another jolt of uncertainty. Every conscious hour of the last 10 years had been devoted to Central Worlds. She had belonged in that service, and had not been aware of her indebtedness to them. Well, she was just going to have to make some drastic reorientations in her thinking. Change was necessary to growth and maturity. She was about to send a peremptory signal to CENTCOM to get a move on when she saw the group emerging from the base tower. Niall Paralon was dwarfed by the 3 other tall men. She recognized the burly figure of Chief Riley, fitting and due her achievement. The other 2 men she identified as Commander Breslaw of Engineering and Admiral Dobranon of Xeno Relations. This wasn't a standard graduation lineup. Sylvia might be right about about Central not letting her off their hook. She'd ought to have called Double M or Sprim. Or Broly. She could hardly blast off now. She'd fry the quartet of notables. So, she lowered the passenger lift and cannily turned up her audio units. However, none of the visitors made any comments until they reached the lock. Then, they only played the precedence routine. However, after Niall Paralon had politely ushered the chief from the lift, he stared at Helva's column with a definitively possessive air. As he stepped into the lock and tossed off the customary salute, it was as if he had proclaimed her as his exclusive property. His audacity staggered her. It wasn't Riley she must guard against. It was this leader-sized, heavy-world Machiavelli Paralon. Dobranon noticed the supervisor's salute. Gentlemen, our manners. And, bringing his boot heels smartly together, he accorded her with the proper ceremony. Surface had such archaic traditions, Helva mused, like saluting a ship on boarding. Or did they salute her as a ranking officer? Probably not. Salutes between persons had to be reciprocal. She'd train her new brain to salute. Her new brawn to salute. Sentimental about the service. And our profound gratitude, Helva, Chief Riley was saying, holding his own salute an overlong moment. Your superb courage and resourcefulness at Borealis are already service legends, a triumph of mind over immobility. We're proud, very proud to have had you on our roster. Helva caught the past tense and wondered again at Paralon's attitude. It's just eating old mail. I love you, dog. You know Dodanon of Xeno and Breslaw of Engineering, of course, the chief went on, so smoothly passing by the adroit admission that Helva wondered if she had heard aright. And why were these 2 here if she were, by tacit admission, an independent? Yes, we've met, she admitted so dryly that the chief chuckled. He gestured for the others to take seats, his deference of moments before giving way to the his deference of moments before giving way to the next order of business. Helva scanned the delegation warily. Paralon gave her a quick sideways grin before he settled himself on the couch, one arm draped negligently across the back. As if he meant to stay a while, Helva thought sourly. I don't know if the directive reached you in transit, Helva, the chief said, but those audiovisual modifications you suggested are going to be built into every new shell. Never again will one of our people have to suffer sense deprivation. I can't imagine why such a contingency wasn't provided for long ago. Breslock cleared his throat and pulled at his left ear, managing not to look at anyone as he replied. Units exist in prematuring shells, Riley, and used to be transferred at final encapsulation of ship-designated personnel until the 4th class. In that century, modifications to the inner shell made direct linkage to the ship's facilities and seemed to make an auxiliary system redundant. Riley frowned. Sometimes these apparent archaic traditions passed along in service do have their place on our modern context. Well, unfortunately, the shell people kidnapped by Zyklon were all of our later classes. Yes, indeed, that was unfortunate, Breslaw. In your case, Helva, the chief went on briskly, there will be no charge for the modification. That puts you right close to payoff. He held up his hand, smiling benignly as Helva started to interrupt. Probably over and to spare. I think there's no question that you'll get full finder's fee and the reward for the apprehension of federal offenders. That comes in from Central Bureau of the Federation. Riley had taken to pacing the length of the cabin. Helva couldn't decide if he had a guilty conscience or was gathering mental takeoff speed. In either case, it augured ill for her. Therefore, Helva, Regulus Base must consider you a free agent, he announced in the stentorious tones, smiling again to contradict apparent reluctance. We're proud of your record, Helva. Very, very proud. He dropped his voice to a confidential aside. All space direct to the contrary, we wish all the BB ships could perform at such efficiency and remove themselves from our fiscal autonomy. Be quite an achievement to run the service in the black. However, pending the confirmation of those rewards, Regulus Base is required to consider you unavailable for a new assignment of any duration. I need to pause for a second. I require beverage. I love you, baby. You're a goober. Sorry about that. And you had one in mind for me. Yes, we did have one in mind, Riley admitted with twinkling eyes and the paternal smile. He glanced expectantly towards Paralon. Oh, rather pointless to waste your valuable time, Chief, discussing it then, isn't it? Helva asked just as Paralon got to his feet. Why, I don't think the Chief would ever consider you a waste of his time, Helva, Paralon said, his eyes mocking, challenging her. Of course, if you've made other plans on your way back from Borealis, it was real courteous of you to check in here and say goodbye. He turned on his heel and started purposefully for the lock. Drop in again sometime. Just wait a minute, Paralon, Riley said. The chief managed to control his expression, but Breslau looked close to panic, and Dobrinon's smile had frozen in alarm. Whatever they had in mind for her must be mighty big. She didn't trust any ploy of Paralon's, but these other two men were keen, solid, honorable specialists. It wouldn't hurt to listen. Paralon got to the lock, turned to give her a hearty wave. Paralon! He halted, hand on the left rail, his face expressing only polite attention. He wasn't giving anything away. What had you cooked up, Paralon? I'd cooked up nothing. Helva ignored Dobrinon's startled exclamation. We had, Paralon admitted, after a glance at the chief, discussed another assignment for the Tango Hotel 834 after that spectacular drug run. Naturally, that mission has been aborted due to the circumstances beyond our control. Helva chuckled to herself, He hadn't let her off lightly on the matter of Taron after all. He'd needle her for the next 25 years for that mistake. As a matter of purely academic interest, until those rewards are posted to me, would you deign to discuss the aborted mission? Hello, baby girl. Hi. I love you. I love you. I have a good girl. No harm in discussing it, certainly, he agreed, and he sauntered back into the cabin. While we wait for confirmation from the Federation, he settled his wiry body into a comfortable position before he continued. It had been originally planned to assign the Tango Hotel 834 to the projected Beta Corvi mission. Beta Corvi? Helva suppressed the flicker of alarm. Then she laughed out loud. Terran of Actaeon in a Corviki shell, coping with the environment? Niall regarded her sardonically for a moment. You yourself made the point that Answer Colmer, a true egocentric, single-minded, stubborn, and pragmatic as hell, suffered the least personality trauma from the phenomena of the Corviki transfer. Taron was so well endowed with the same sterling attributes that it was obvious that he'd not last a minute as a personality on Beta Corvi, and you know it, Niall Paralon. That man was incapable of coping with such anomalies. Paralon's tactics infuriated her. Why, what he had suggested was nothing short of bald murder. And he talked Riley into the scheme, and they'd both wanted to get rid of Taron? Or had they both wanted to get rid of Taron? Oh, now really, Helva, Riley said, stepping forward as if separating two antagonists. I was never in favor of Taron as your brawn, if you'll forgive me the reminder. You were right, Chief. You were right, Chief, Helva said, so sweet and contrite a tone that Paralon snorted in disgust. And sorry to be, I assure you, however, no harm appears to have resulted. Except that Helva's now a free agent, Paralon said in a completely expressionless voice. Exactly, Riley continued with an unexpected enthusiasm. And, unless Helva has other plans in mind, perhaps we can make her see the advantage of undertaking this new mission in spite of her changed status. There was an odd half-smile on Paralon's face as he returned his chief's intense stare. Yes, perhaps we can, the supervisor said, with a hearty lack of enthusiasm. Helva saw Dobrynon give him a quizzical look, and Breslau was plainly startled. Something was going amiss with their sales pitch. Well then, Helva, Riley started off determinedly. Have you any plans in mind? She's had no time to advertise, Niall said abruptly. She made no planetary calls on the return trip here, and I doubt that even the most assiduous of our known informers has had time to discover that the X-Ray Hotel 834 has paid off. It so rarely occurs this early in service. I'll answer for myself, thank you, Paralon. The others were staring at their colleague with blank astonishment. The atmosphere in the cabin had become strained. Helva was at a loss to figure out why Paralon was deliberately disrupting the mood Riley was attempting to create. Trust him to have an ulterior motive, but what? So, my enterprising supervisor planned to have me go back to Beta Corvi, and that somewhat explains Admiral Dobrynon's presence, and you, Commander Breslau, or is it engineering bidding against Xeno for my services? We're hoping to combine forces, Helva, Dobrynon answered after an uncomfortable pause. Someone has missed his cue, Helva thought. It seemed appropriate, Breslau said, breaking his silence, that you should be the first ship to benefit from the discoveries resulted from the Beta Corvi data you brought back. If engineering had used the stabilizing key for unstable isotopes... Just how would I have benefited? Helva asked casually. She kept one eye on Paralon. He was adept at titillation. She wouldn't put it past him to have staged this whole thing, including his own apparent disinterest, to arouse her to indiscretion. Of course she'd wanted improved FTL drive. When we began to study the basic theories, Breslau was saying... When we began to study the basic theories, Breslau was saying, we could see an immediate application to our present FTL system. You're surely aware, Helva, that the potential of the FTL principle is vastly beyond present performance. The problem has been an energy source that could tolerate the demands full FTL speed requires. The Korviki data makes intergalactic travel possible in a decade. This year. Intergalactic travel? Helva's excitement matched Breslau's. Between which galaxies? This one and the Horsehead Nebula? Yes, the intergalactic distances traversed in a fraction of present estimates, Riley said, as if he sensed that they had her attention. Imagine it, Helva. Unlimited power, literally inexhaustible power, to take you to the edge of the galaxies visible from the rim of the Milky Way beyond any space now known to man. Riley spoke urgently, firing her desire. Power to make those FTL drive components work efficiently for the first time since they were designed. All we've lacked was the constant fuel source to stand up to the drain of the energy required, and you've the chance to explore unknown space. You can chart new star systems, open up whole galaxies to central worlds. That reminder brought her out of those stars. Interesting. Very interesting. The FTL always has been a case of having a good cart and no draft animal strong enough. However, this radical new development stemmed from the Korviki data. Why is another mission necessary? Riley gestured to Breslau, who began whipping out cube graphs and computer tapes, which he arranged nervously on her console. With the Korviki data for stabilizing unstable isotopes, we were able to make use of that form of waste energy, not just for the fractional seconds of half-life before the AMUs deteriorated, but for as long as that power was needed. Imagine it, Helva, said Breslau's eyes glowed with wonder. The power of an exploding star always equal to that of the exploding star at its highest energy level. The cabin seemed to darken at his words. It was an exploding star operating at its highest energy level, Ravel's sun, that had burned Jenin to death as she had frantically tried to outrun its fantastic energy. But to have such power enslaved to her requirements? Oh, she had to have it. An inner nova to expiate the crime of the outer, Hammuraban justice at its purest. She forced herself to listen to Breslau's explanations. Admittedly, Helva, there are tremendous subtleties involved which, I readily confess, no one in my team is scientifically sophisticated enough to appreciate. It's almost as if the Corvi were discussing personal intimacies rather than subparticular facts. But the result is a fantastic discipline of nucleonic forces. As you'll notice, Helva, and he pointed at the first cube and tapped the equations into the ship's computer, the isotopes are permitted to radiate energy in cycles, but instead of a decrease in the energy available as the deterioration occurs, the energy level remains constant. By varying the number of cycles initiated per second, or millisecond for that matter, and Breslau beamed with paternal fondness for the abilities of his development, the FTL drive receives the power it requires to exceed the speed of light by any multiple required. To traverse a given distance in a given length of time, the original FTL equations supply the rate of cycle variation needed. With an unexpectedly dramatic flourish for such a pragmatic man, Breslau tapped out a set of voyage requirements. If you have to get to, say, Mirfak 2 in 2 standard days, you can now, instead of taking, how long? 4 weeks, Helva supplied the answer absently, more intent on following the print-in of the profoundly interesting equations. 4 weeks, then. Well, you can see the advantages. And then Helva understood what necessitated the new mission to Beta Corvi. One could scarcely try to release that kind of energy within a solar system without knowing the subjective and objective effects. What disadvantages have you observed? She asked. Are these computations based on experiment or sheer theory? Doubt and concern dampened Breslau's ardor. We have tested the CV energy source, cycle variant. We took every possible precaution, used a very slow cyclage rate. It was impossible to keep the experimental vessel in range of the testing instrumentation. Was the vehicle manned or BB? Manned. Breslau's answer was just audible. The effect of such acceleration on the personnel was fatal? Well, not that we know of. Breslau glanced sharply at Riley, who had been talking in a low voice to Paralon. Before Helva could turn up her audio, the two separated, Riley joining Dobrnon on the couch, leaving Paralon alone opposite them. Nal's face was inscrutably polite, his eyes guarded. Well, why don't you know? The vessel hasn't returned. The estimated time of arrival is 9 years standard, and it has been sighted returning on normal drive. Their last intercepted communications indicated we must proceed with immense caution in the use of the power source. Evidently, I'd also hazard a heavy hand was on the CV switch to get that far out of comm range. You should have used a BB ship with no fragile bronze to clutter up a test run. There was also a suggestion that we may have misused the Beta Corvi data. Breslau went on, nodding thoughtfully at her observation. You can easily extrapolate the destructive potential of the CV factor. We must be sure we have not perverted the data and unleashed uncontrollable or unstable emissions that might have had cosmic repercussions. Breslau looked towards her, both worried and hopeful. Hello, Mischief Maker. You are not eating tissues. You are not allowed. It is not good. I love you. That could be some pile to put rods in, Alva mused, although she hoped that they wouldn't have to damp that reactor. Intergalactic travel, the test ship flowing 9 years away from known space. Well, first, I am gratified by the confidence you have in me, gentlemen, she said after a long moment. However, I cannot help wondering if you selected me because, being paid off, in theory that is, I am therefore most expendable, constituting no embarrassing debit loss on the fiscal records. Only Paralon appreciated her levity, and he laughed with uninhibited delight. Your facetious attitude is ill-timed, Helva, Riley remonstrated. You are the least expendable of our ship personnel. I fail to see, Paralon, the humor in such an outrageous suggestion. There was no mistaking the anger behind his reprimand. In that case, Helva said, you're a low species of extortionist. Oh, what? Riley bellowed, diverted from Nile. You know perfectly well, Chief Riley, that I'd want to discuss such a drive once I knew of its existence. Or I'd want to possess such a drive as soon as I knew of its existence. I'd certainly want to remain in Central World service to get it. Paralon sobered instantly, staring at her. That's the game, isn't it? Helva demanded, her voice cold because she was talking to Paralon, and he knew it now. He kept staring at her, the muscles in his jaw twitching. Frankly, yes, Riley answered when it was obvious Paralon would not. There's not much time for you to decide. How so? Some subtle change in Riley's face roused her to bitter anger. So this was how Central Worlds treated their BB ships. She should have called in Double M and Sprim. She should have got in touch with Broly. Let Central Worlds fight its own fires. Central Worlds is bound by Federation directives, Helva. Directives controlled and promulgated by the peoples of this civilized galaxy. There is no latitude on some of these strictures. You are under your original obligation to Central Worlds until those additional bonuses come through from the Federation. After that, an entirely different set of directives controls the kind of authority, the kind of contract, the wording and restrictions of the clauses, the payments, prerogatives, and of any further dealings we have with the BB ships. If we operated any other way, Helva, Riley went on implacably, we would have the humanities guardians scanning our tapes, sitting on our shoulders, hindering our operations. But you have proved to be an extremely capable contractee. The service needs you. Our need has so far been to your benefit. You have been given extraordinary opportunities to achieve payoff early in your career. We felt you might consider that at this time, when we are offering you the chance to be the first BB ship with a fully realized FTL drive. If apologies are in order, I kindly accept them. I did not realize that contract terms changed after payoff was achieved. However, you can scarcely blame me for wanting to understand all of the factors involved in what was only to be a discussion pending confirmation of these rewards. Inherent in Commander Breslau's explanation is the possibility that I could blow myself into a nova. I protest! Breslau jumped to his feet. You can see that the theory is valid. It has been tested. And scared you into taking the precaution of checking against perversion of data. I like my skin, gentlemen. I prefer it in one piece. Your shell is solid titanium, Breslau said heatedly. Impervious to the full power of an exploding sun in my guts? Helva snapped. I've already suffered from the heat of a nova, Breslau, and this solid titanium shell of mine has proven to be no sanctuary against injury and the perversions of man. Breslau sank to the couch, utterly deflated. Of the others, only Paralon suffered neither embarrassment nor chagrin. He had only jerked his head towards her column at her rebuttal. His lips were set in too bitter a line even for the cynical supervisor. For a moment, his eyes were unguarded, reflecting a physical pain and expression Helva had seen once before in the eyes of a dying man. It was he who broke the silence, speaking in a heavy, tired voice. There's been no attempt to mask the danger involved, Helva, and we've tried to make an unwieldy forest of restrictions work for you. It would be more advantageous for you to extend the original contract than to enter a completely new one. You can check your files on that if you doubt me. We can amend some of the old clauses. We cannot change any of the new. Now, have the courtesy to hear us out, and then a simple yes or no is all that is required. He sounded indifferent to that decision now, and she couldn't understand why. Dobranon cleared his throat and walked slowly towards her column as if gathering his disrupted thoughts. The projected mission to Beta Corvi had multiple purposes, Helva. Everyone needing abilities, talents, and background that pointed inexorably to you. I'll explain those that relate to my sphere of activity. I believe that we could condition future observers to withstand the psychological disorientation of the Korviki transfers. If we had some idea of the change taking place in the human psyche that has been retained in the Korviki entity. Yes, this is asking for a double portion of your soul's flesh, Hilva, but I have an altruistic reason for asking you to return there. Paralan and I are both positive that if you could return and reassure yourself as to the integration or disintegration of the personalities of Solar Prane, Kurla, Ster, and Shadras and Ansra Kolmer in their Korviki environment, you might be able to resolve the sense of guilt and failure that resulted from the outcome of this first mission. You are the best qualified, if not the only person capable of recognizing the immigrants. Dobranon gave a faint smile at his description. It was apt, Helva thought, trying not to admit how the notion of return scared and tempted her. Now, Davo Philonaster has volunteered to return, but frankly, his psych profile indicates a deep trauma. I suspect that he would immigrate too. Very unsettling, I assure you, Helva said. She didn't like the mental picture of Davo Philonaster's body stretched out uninhabited on a couch, but if Prane and Kurla and Shadras were content as Korviki... No, Helva forced her mind away. Well, it's obvious we are going to need the Korviki help if we are to play with their toys without damaging the entire galaxy. I assume my psych profile was run through and you feel that you can trust me to return? Yes, Dobranon's answer was prompt and firm. Even after the Borealis sense deprivation? I'd hazard the guess that the Korviki experience helped you during that episode. Shrewd of you, Dobranon. We are all, are we not, the sum of our experiences, which brings me to a sordid subject. I assume, Admiral Breslau, that the CV factor will be installed in my drive chambers before I undertake a return to Beta Corvi. Yes, that would be a necessity. How else could they assess our application of their data? And the cost of such an installation? Breslau glanced nervously at Riley. The chief inclined his head. We can't determine the exact cost. The experimental vessel was rebuilt several times, shielding is reinforced, structural members doubled, a new alloy on the hull. Well, I'd estimate it in the neighborhood of 500,000 galactic credits. He had the grace to look appalled, Helva noticed, although the staggering cost left her relatively unmoved. After all, she'd paid off more than that already. That would be if I contracted immediately. Yes. And about twice that if the old contract lapsed? I expect so. Breslau closed his folders disconsolately, as if he had now abandoned all hope of this project. This kind of pessimism irritated Helva immeasurably. However, Helva, if you extend the old contract, we are in a position to flex any conditions that bind a person of your proven abilities, Riley said smoothly. Don't pressure me, Riley. I haven't considered all the angles from my point of view. That was not true. She had made up her mind. She'd made Riley flex those conditions. She would make Riley flex those conditions that bound a person of her proved ability until Sprim and Double M could hear the regulations cracking. Paralon had certainly crooked up a real tight orbit for her, and she'd bet her next bonus that he knew exactly what an effect Breslau's description of that power source would have on her. He didn't miss a trick, that one. He'd have seen the justice of enslaving a Nova to her bidding after what Ravel's son had done to Jenin, and he certainly had pointed out what guilt resolution gimmick to Dobronon. Or had pointed out that guilt resolution gimmick to Dobronon, while she'd show this egotistical, self-assured, domineering, Machiavellian refugee from a heavy world. Hela brought her polemic to an abrupt halt, and stared down at Paralon. His face was drawn into dark lines of strain and exhaustion. There was no trace in the slumped shoulders of the arrogant manipulator who called her bluff by being ready to walk out before he'd even started. There was no malicious gleam in the back of the unguarded eyes, apathetically turned on her column. He must have known he'd won, and sure of her interest. Was he regretting his machinations? He certainly looked as if he regretted something from somewhere in his ill-starred past. Find time to feel sorry for Niall Paralon. She must keep firmly in mind that they wanted her very badly indeed for some pretty substantial reasons, and that they were going to have to pay for her. I assume that the probability curve is high in my favor, she broke the silence to ask. Riley nodded. As I mentioned, Dobronon said quickly, you are the most likely person to identify the immigrants if there is any trace of their previous personality in the Korviki entities. You don't think there will be? Dobronon shrugged. How can one gauge the depth of transfer and with totally alien structure and psychology? As a human, I prefer to think of some vestige of the humanoid remains. I recommend, however, that your initial contact be extremely brief. That is, he amended discreetly, if you decide to undertake the mission. Under no circumstances would you be asked to jeopardize yourself in the search of the others. The primary goal of the mission is to obtain the Korviki evaluation of the CV data. Breslau spoke up. He glanced anxiously at Dobronon, who shrugged his acquiescence to the priority. Oh, she had them now. I should very much like to have that drive if it's feasible, Hela said. Why on earth would Paralon flinch? Were they hiding something after all? My personal faith in you has been vindicated, Riley declared, his usual jovial self. But you're going to have to agree to a few stipulations of mine, or there is no point in proceeding any further. You've never been unreasonable, Helva, and I do have the authority to stretch a few regulations in your favor. You'd better listen to my conditions before you make any promises, Riley, Helva said dryly. I'm not about to mortgage my soul for 25 years or so, paying off 500,000 credits on the supposition that CV drive will be vetted by the Korviki, and I'll resolve a few dangling traumas in the process. I think there's a stain on my shirt. This extension of my old contract will be void if the CV drive is not feasible. You can junk the modifications to my hull. I'll pay for the cost of the alloy coating, and you'll just have to write the rest off as an experimental loss. That's what it'll be. There was a hurried conference between Riley and Breslau, with Riley reluctantly giving in to the engineer's persuasions. All right. Second, I can use my own judgment on the advisability of contacting the human immigrants on Corvi, with no penalty for not completing all phases of the planned mission. I think Dobronon made that contingency clear. Third, the matter of a brawn partner. You have certainly proved that you can operate better without a brawn, Riley interrupted her. All cooperation. Paralon made an inarticulate sound in his throat. You had something to say, Supervisor? May I finish? Helva demanded acidly. It is almost bedtime, Gooper. Paralon, at least, is well aware of my continuous demands for a permanent brawn. I do not like to operate alone. I detest it. What would be most inadvisable, Dobronon put in anxiously. I will not undertake this mission at all without the brawn of my choice, she said, raising her voice above the others. I heartily concur, Riley. This Corviki psyche exchange has tremendous emotional kickback. Paralon and I feel strongly, but when Dobronon glanced towards the supervisor for confirmation, he got no response at all and hurriedly continued. That is imperative for Helva to be sustained by a strong, empathetic brawn who has a buffer to the trauma of the experience. It is 10:15. That is why I'm fuzzing. That is my excuse, and I'm sticking to it. The whole discussion can be terminated right now, Riley, if my conditions are not met. They are, as your experts agree, reasonable. Riley acquiesced, but his smile had disappeared. Good. My final condition also hinges on the success of the drive. You have set me 500,000 credits to pay off. Acceptable. However, with the CV utilizing the full potential of the FTL drive, I will be able to get from here to there in next to no time at all. I'd be working my tail off for you. I hardly think that the old scale of salary and bonuses would apply to the new level of mobility. Riley began to protest, volubly mentioning the possibility that Breslau's estimate of 500,000 credits was conservative, but he was willing to accept that fee. Pure extortion, she interrupted him. For that matter, I am expected to absorb the cost of any expensive adjustments that the Corviki might recommend. I've got that to consider too, as well as service to a completely new power source. No, Riley, I'm sure that Double M and Sprim might very well consider that the old rate of pay will need some adjustment upwards to compensate for my increased efficiency. Heh, she'll be the fastest thing in the galaxy, Breslau said. Whose side are you on, Breslau? Well, in this case, Helva's, the engineer replied, unintimidated. I'm only asking for a reasonable 1/3 increase. Surely not excessive for such a loyal employee of Central Worlds. I'm sure you'll contrive to get your money's worth out of me if I know how you operate. How I operate? Riley swung around to glare pointedly at Paralon. Paralon operates his section under your orders, Chief, Helva said, and the dictates of expediency. She was sorry that she said it the moment the words were out. Paralon's withdrawal was obvious to the others now. He, not the chief, had initiated this project. He had neatly layered the odds against her refusing it. She couldn't imagine what was wrong with him now. He had simply dropped out of the arguments, ignored the discussions, was totally immersed in that private struggle. She was sorry for him. She hated him. She needed him, and she was about to get him. She couldn't beat him, but she could join him. Do you agree to my conditions, Riley, or don't you? Take 'em or leave 'em. Dobronon and Breslau added their entreaties, and Helva didn't really need to hear Riley's growl of consent to know that he'd had no real alternative either. She'd say this for Riley. He was a good loser. For a long moment after he called the revisions in on the base's computer and made them official, he stood with his head down, staring at the pilot's console. When he turned back, his face was impassive. I was warned you might drive a stiff bargain, Helva. He flicked a glance at Paralon. I didn't think a BB ship would ever outguess me, but you're goddamn right. He added, his eyes flashing. When you say that I'll work your tail off while you're still a Central World ship. Fair enough. Now, Breslaw is going to want you at the maintenance docks to lay in the CV drives. You'll retain all standard equipment until the Beta Corvi vet the new drive, and yes, that's included in the 500,000. Dobrano has a stack of results on his analysis for the Beta Corvi trauma for you to print into your banks. It's as much Niall's work as mine, Dobrano said. Again, trying to draw the silent man into the discussion. We had several astute correlations to make from the debriefing and psych tapes of the others on that mission that have helped my staff formulate such preliminary conclusions as we've been able to make. Yes, Paralon's very helpful, Riley muttered. So, there's just the proper brawn left to be discussed. Right now... Hold it, Helva interrupted him. I thought I made it clear to you that I will only undertake the Beta Corvi run with a partner of my choice. Whether that man continues after Beta Corvi is not an issue. Riley turned to her, his eyes wary. Yes, we had agreed to that, but you also said you wanted a permanent brawn. I do, but I won't go to Beta Corvi unless Paralon goes with me. She ignored Riley's explosive protest and the astonished exclamations and congratulations from Dobrano and Breslaw. Her eyes, her mind, her being were focused on Niall. The wiry little man turned, his eyes seeking the exact spot on the column parallel to her head. This is a bad time for jokes, Helva. I am not joking, my boy. By all that's holy, Paralon, Helva's a genius! Dobrano cried delightedly, clapping the unresisting shoulder. And she's called your bluff. Indeed she has. You've always boasted you could outbrawn any man in the service, Riley said in a dry, cool voice. There had been no vindictiveness in Helva's nomination, but there was in Riley's prompt ratification. A little field work will make you a better supervisor. I think Helva can rectify that fluctuating gravity problem that bugged the test ship, Breslaw assured Paralon, and there's always the shockweb for added protection. Abruptly, they left. Niall Paralon remained troubled and dazed, reacting not at all in any of the ways that she could understand. You've got to be joking, Helva, he said, his voice cracking, despite the obvious effort to control himself. Why? You know more about brawning than anyone in service, you know the Korviki problem backwards and forwards, and you undoubtedly researched Breslaw's equations thoroughly before... Oh, of course I did! And the control was gone. His words tumbled out, harsh and bitter. Do you think I'd let you walk into something I hadn't checked thoroughly? I rigged this farce, but I did. Not Riley. I talked him into it, and Breslaw, and Dobrano, too, once I saw the possibility of hooking you. That was obvious. You didn't have a chance, Helva, because I knew every button to push on you and when, and God's help me, I did. You are undoubtedly the most unscrupulous supervisor in the service, she agreed, countering his scathing self-contempt with unruffled humor. And that was a fartling underhanded trick you just served me. You're not even listening to me, you stupid tin-plated witch. Can't you understand what I did to you? I made you stay in the service. No, I elected to stay on my terms. Niall stared wildly at her, his eyes dark with the conflict that was tearing him apart. All arrogance, all self-confidence had been stripped from him. This was too violent a reaction to finding himself momentarily outmaneuvered. Your conditions? Now there's another real fine example of cosmic justice. And he laughed hoarsely at the irony that only he could see. Maybe you'd better let me in on that joke, Niall. I could use a laugh, even if it's on me. There were tears in his eyes now, and he held his clenched fist rigid against his thighs. I rigged all of this, Helva, because I, Niall Paralon, could not let you leave Central World Service. Oh, yes, I put every mission your way that I could to help you, that would help you pay off. And when you actually had, I found that I couldn't tolerate the prospect. So I set up all those clever nardy ploys to keep you in, only when I saw you reacting just as I planned you should, I knew I'd used my position for the most despicable act in a long series of clever, shrewd, despicable manipulations. And I couldn't stop what I'd started. I couldn't even think of a way to get you out of this mess. And then you, Helva, want me, Paralon, for your brawn. His laugh was a cry of anguish. That doesn't change my option, Paralon, she said forcefully. She had to override that horrible laughing. I want you for a brawn as selfishly as you want me in the service, and it'll be safer to have you for my brawn than for my supervisor. There isn't much else for me to do anyway but stay with Central Worlds, she added in a gentler voice. You did make it possible for me to stay on my terms, because they farthing well know that I'm the only ship to do this job. I want you as brawn, Nile Paralon, because you are clever, devious, despicable, or you're clever, devious, despicable, unscrupulous, and demanding, because you do know the right buttons to push on me. You're not much on looks and size, but I've been that road. I'll trust you to bring me back out of anything, even Beta Corvi. Trust me? It was a scream starting from his guts. His body was shaking with effort. You freaked out, half-grown, wire-hated... You romantic tin-assed fool! You trust me? Don't you realize that I know every single thing there is to know about you? I even had a chromosomal extract made, so I know what you look like, and I know the release syllables that they coded in your panel not 7 days ago. Trust me? I'm the last person you can trust. Choose me as a brawn? God! Helva was staggered by this disclosure. Paralon had a brawn fixation on her. She wanted to sing hallelujahs. She wanted to scream with rage. She was exalted and full of panic. But she knew what to do. She'd better. A brawn's irrational desire to see the face of his brain partner was scarcely uncommon when there was a deep emotional attachment between partners. It was usually thwarted by the difficulty of removing the access panel. But if Nile had those guarded syllables, she had to deal with this fixation one way or the other. That's why I can't be your brawn, Helva, Nile said in a broken voice. And don't give me that acid warble about fixations are common and cured. I know the release syllables, and one day it would be too much for Nile, boy. I'd have to open up that coffin they've sealed you in. I'd have to look at your beautiful face, touch that god-lovely smile, and hold you. He'd moved, fighting the drive for his body every inch until he was eagle-spread against her column, his cheek pressed against the cold metal, his fingertips white with the effort to penetrate the unyielding surface. One hand slid slowly towards the access panel, yet his face was oddly clear, serene, almost happy, his eyes closed as if he already held her against him. Well, then say the syllables, she cried passionately. Open the panel, breach the shell, stare at my face, and hold my twisted body. It would be better for me to die at your hands than to remain an inviolate virgin without you. With an inarticulate cry, he jumped back as if the metal had burned him. His face was contorted in a terrible grimace. If you didn't then, Nile, you never will, she said, keeping her voice gentle and soothing, suppressing the unexpected longing that threatened to rob her of her sanity. God, Elbow, no! He whirled, running to the lock, jamming down the controls on the lift. He jumped from it before it reached the ground level and disappeared into the tower. I can only wait, she thought bitterly. He's got to make this decision himself. He's got to want to come back because he's sure that he can trust himself. My implicit trust in him is irrelevant. He must be the initiator, the manipulator, the schemer. Why didn't I slam the lock shut? Why didn't I keep him there until he realized that he's all right now? That the critical moment had come and gone. All his defenses had been down. He'll never be that vulnerable again, neither to himself nor to me. He's got to see that when he gets himself under control. Surely he'll be back soon. All that arrogance, jaunty swaggering with self-assurance. If the fixation is so deep, he'll have to come back. He couldn't stay away. Only a Nile Paralon could. If one Nile Paralon decided that was what he had to do, he's that kind of man. He can rationalize away all the deceitful, collusive, unprincipled things that he does, dismiss them from his mind once they'd accomplished their purpose, but set him up against pressure on his deepest integrity, touch him in the core of the reluctant goodness and honesty, and Nile Paralon could make the noble gesture, the uncharacteristic sacrificial act, and foul them up both for the rest of their lives. Should she call Riley? He'd act instanter. On what? Now had gone into the tower to think, consider, to decide. She sincerely hoped to come back. After that, they'd put Riley through, she'd better not roil him unnecessarily, particularly against Niall. And Helva was stuck again, waiting with her lock wide open and the lift on ground level immobilized. So, that is where we left off the first time we recorded. And it is 10:30 and time for Uncle Navi to get to bed, because I am terrible about getting to bed at the right time. And meanwhile, we have to get Opal to bed because she is a good girl and she has a doctor's appointment in the morning. They're taking her into surgery to get her tummy fixed. So, if you're the praying sort, then keep her in mind. Because she's a very good girl and she deserves good girl things. But anyway, get some rest and do your best. Try to become somebody that you can be proud of. And if people can hate without knowing a thing about you, then I can love you for exactly the same reason. Have a good night, dear. Sleep well.